So, Donald, we will get to Coach Builder in a moment, but I want to start with a more foundational form of building early life and the family unit.
Okay.
Can you talk to me about the importance of fatherhood in your life?
Oh my gosh. I got married at 42 for the first time. Was a happily, you know, preoccupied writer for all my 20s and 30s. And so didn't get married till much later, and then became a dad at 49. So, now I'm 52 and I have a 2.5-year-old, and it is everything to me. And I am so glad in many ways. There's pros and cons to being a dad later, but I'm so glad because I don't think I would have known how important and how meaningful that journey would have been certainly in my 20s. I mean, my mid 20s, I wouldn't have known that. I would have been out trying to grind out my identity. In the way I get my identity is actually just from succeeding in whatever project I'm working on. So I think I needed to have some projects that I was successful at before I realized this actually isn't as meaningful as they told me it was going to be, or as I thought it was going to be. But there is no diminishing return on the fulfillment I get from being a dad. It is everything to me. In fact, I don't want to offend people who don't have kids, uh, but there was a feeling when I became a dad that I just sort of thought, oh, this is what life is about. You know what I mean? I mean, it's about a lot of things, but you kind of build your career and you find for a man, for me, you find a woman that you really love, and you built sort of a home together, and you add a kid and you realize, oh, this is why we fell in love, and this is why we built a home, and this is why I make money, and this is why I have to keep my reputation clean, because if I do something stupid, it's going to affect this innocent little girl. Like, everything suddenly was tied together in this 2.5-year-old. And it kind of played into the Stockholm syndrome of our first 6 months being parents. We were like, wait, we are being trapped by this child that we are in love with. We can't even leave the house. So, I just think at the end of the day, and by that I mean on my deathbed, the most important thing to me will have been the relationship I had with my daughter, which only is a good relationship if I had a really great, loving, romantic relationship with her mom. So I don't know. I wonder if I'd have had that thought earlier, but I certainly have it now.
Mhm.
And so I try to reverse engineer a little bit of life to reflect and honor that sense of meaning that I've been gifted to experience, and so many of us have been gifted to experience. So, that all, at the same time, you know, we have a toddler, so it's frustrating. Not to say it's perfect by any
So,
stretch of the imagination.
so a couple of ideas come to mind when I hear you say that. First of all, I remember when I had my first child, and I remember, I think I put this in like our Christmas card that year, back in the days when I did Christmas cards. And I said something like, I feel more me than ever.
That's a beautiful thing to say.
And
You
it's very
know,
similar to what you just described.
it is. There was my dad left when I was 2. I did not know him. When I was in my early 30s, I found him and knocked on his door. Literally drove from Chicago to Evansville, Indiana, and knocked on his door and said, "My name is Donald Miller, and I'm your son." He had a warning. I called him the day before and left him a voicemail and said, "I'm coming." And he called me back, and I didn't answer the phone because I was too scared. But I physically went to him, and it was an incredible exchange. That's not the point of your question, but I wondered whether I'd be any good as a dad, because
Mm.
I didn't see one. And then I realized very quickly what I saw were all these mentors and men in my life who were so incredible that it was almost like, you know, I don't want to say it was better, but these were really great men, and I wasn't lacking in a whole lot that I couldn't go figure out. But I wasn't expecting my identity to become a dad. My identity is a best-selling author and a business owner and all these wins and these worldly trophies that I had. But it was amazing how quickly none of that mattered to my identity as much as being a dad. Like, that was it. I just thought my life got very small, as did yours, I'm sure. Winning suddenly had nothing to do with anybody else's opinion about anything.
Yeah.
Or winning was just connecting with my daughter and and making sure she knows that she's loved and she's safe. And quite honestly, those are pretty easy things to
Yeah.
attain when you have a toddler, because they worship you no matter what.
Right. Because you're trapped at home with them.
Because you're trapped at home with them.
In
That's
all the
right.
best ways. So I'm thinking two other thoughts, and I'm thinking then you might have a few further reflections. Is you talked about, that grinding around your identity in your 20s and 30s, and I'm thinking about Richard Rohr, who I'm sure you're familiar with his
Yes.
work, and which I love, and how in your younger years or the first half of your life, you're building the container, and then you're filling the container in the second half of your life. And it's interesting because you built the container, and then by the time you finished building the container, then you were ready to have children. So you didn't plan it that way,
Right.
but it's quite lovely. And then the quote that came into my mind as you were talking is Samuel Johnson: "The ultimate result of all ambition is to be happy at home."
If that's true, I've achieved it. That's really terrific. I absolutely love that. Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna
You
remember
remember
that.
that. Yeah. All right. So now let's go back to your 20s and 30s when you were grinding. So you started out as a textbook publisher, according to our research, eventually warming up to the idea of publishing your own writing.
Yes.
What was the process like of deciding that you had something to say to the world?
Well, I did in high school. I think my junior year in high school, there was this youth group speaker who came to our youth group. And he, I'm not sure who he was or what he said, but he did ask us to kind of help us, have a vision for our lives. And he said, I want you to sit down and write a letter to explain what you're going to do with your life and have a vision for your life. And we're going to pull names out of a hat of other people in the youth group. You're going to write the letter to that person. So you're not going to write it to yourself. You're going to write it to that person. You're going to give it to them, and they're going to read what you want to do with your life. So, in that, I lived in Texas. I remember Texas. I lived there until I was 21. So I remember it being very, very hot, very, very humid. And I wrote a letter that said, I'm going to leave Texas. I'm going to live in Oregon. And literally, Whitney, I wanted to live in Oregon because I thought it bordered Canada. I did not take geography. I thought this is the furthest you can get from the sun. So I'm going to go up there. I wanted to be a New York Times bestselling author. I wrote in this letter. And I wanted to be a millionaire. And at the time, a millionaire was like a millionaire. Today, a millionaire is like
A billionaire.
a lot of thousandaire.
Mhm.
But gave it to Sandy Whitley, who was my best friend's girlfriend. And let's see, almost 20 years later, she called me. I had no memory of writing this letter. And she called me and she said, Don, it's Sandy. And I said, Sandy, my gosh, what's going on? And she's married to somebody else and had this great life. And so we caught up for 30 minutes, and she goes, hey, I was moving some boxes in the attic and I found this letter you sent me. Can I read this to you? Because I find it quite amazing. Well, she actually said, how much money do you have? And I said, Sandy, that's a weird question. How much money do I have? She goes, well, I know you live in Oregon and I know you're a New York Times bestselling author. So I need to know how much money you have. I'm like, wait, how do you, why are those three things connected? She said, let me read you this letter. And I lived in Oregon. I was a New York Times bestselling author. I wasn't a millionaire, but if you added the value of my house and the equity, might be able to squeak out something like that, but was already starting to succeed in business. I say already, I was in my mid 30s. It's not like I was an early bloomer. And to me, that was like, it was amazing in the sense that I realized, wow, that letter actually determined a subconscious direction for my life so I only say that to say I actually wanted to be a commercially successful writer very early on in high school. I graduated high school at 17. So I was probably 15 or 16 years old. And then ended up writing getting a buddy came through, or he was from Oregon, and he came through Houston in a Volkswagen camping van. He was traveling around the country and we became friends. I didn't know him, but we became friends then. And he invited me to get in the van and go with him back to Oregon to finish his trip. And, I heard Oregon. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. I'm supposed to go to Oregon. And I, for the stupidest reason is because it's not as hot.
And it's
So
Canada.
I got in his van, and the whole time we were in the van, it was about 3 months. The final month, we ended up just living in the woods outside of a cattle ranch, working on this cattle ranch. And the whole time I'm like, boy, this would make a great book. Years went by. I tried to write, terrible, it was hard to do. And I got a job at a publishing company, literally in the warehouse. And 4 years later, I was the president of that publishing company. So I discovered I'm really just sort of intuitively good at business. And then I interacted with all these authors and interacting with these book buyers. I got to know how the industry worked. And then at night, I went home and said, I'm going to write this book about that road trip I took 7 years ago. And I wrote a book called Prayer in the Art of Volkswagen Maintenance. Because I had so many contacts in publishing, I was a textbook publisher, but because I had so many contacts and been to so many book conventions and all that kind of stuff, was able to make a few calls. The publishers that I called and sent them samples of the book liked it, and all of them offered contracts. So, and there was a slight little bidding war, and got a book published. That book failed, sold 10,000 copies, but that was very humbling because I thought, okay, this is actually not easy. And then, but I knew how to write a book at that point and had published a book and knew how to sell a book because I was in publishing, and started my own publishing company, wrote a book called Blue Like Jazz, was my second book. And that book sold more than 1 million copies. And all of a sudden I didn't have a publishing company anymore. I was a writer and a speaker. And that's when Sandy called and said, you won't believe this. So I don't know what all that means, Whitney. But that's kind of the journey I took. It makes it sound easy, but you got to realize it was like 1.5 years to write that book that failed. And then another 1.5 years to write the book that succeeded with no guarantee that I was going to be able to make a living doing this. And then I say I had my own publishing company. I would have to call a bookstore and go and drive to that bookstore with a trunk full of books in hopes that they would buy these books that I published so that I could pay my rent. I mean, there was no financial success in my life till I was in my mid-30s and had a book on the New York Times bestseller. It's the first time I'd ever made more than probably $25,000. There's a lot of and that's the other reason I wasn't married till I was 42. I was just poor. And so, a lot of struggle in there, but I discovered that I loved to write, was just obsessed with literature and how it worked and how books came together and how stories came together. I don't know that it meant much to me. I mean, I guess it meant a lot to be published because, it's a finish line, if you will.
Yeah.
But I really liked the writing process and still do to this day.
That is a fantastic story. And a couple of thoughts, reflections. Number one is that it's interesting hearing you say that 10,000 books is a failure because you've seen the statistics.
Oh yeah, for me, 10,000 books meant I can't pay rent.
You can't eat. Right. 10,000 books mean you can't pay rent, you can't eat. And
small price to pay to be an artist.
Exactly. And yet we know, the data, and I'm probably going to get my numbers off slightly, but 90%, 95% of all business books don't sell more than 5,000 books. So so that's one thing. But the bigger thing for me is the power of intention.
Isn't that true?
You wrote that letter in high school, Oregon, New York Times bestseller, make more than $1 million. And you planted it in your subconscious, those seeds, and then they grew.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I'm such a believer in that. That story made me such a believer in that in fact, yesterday morning, sat down and went over a life plan again and just said, this is who you're going to be. This is where you're going to be in 10 years. And so much of that, I mean, that's one story. That has continued to be true, that you sit down, you do it again. And 5 years later, you're like, I cannot believe we have 30 employees. Right. And, even this morning I was doing a cold plunge in my swimming pool and, I just started praying, and I pray in the swimming pool. It's like, God, I'd love to, have 25,000 coaches in this program that we're building. And I'd love to, do this and do that. And, a lot of it is just future casting and vision casting. And then I take that stuff to God because I'm absolutely convinced God loves to build things with people.
Oof.
I'm just convinced that I just love. I think it sounds like I'm going to him asking for a favor or asking for him to bless me. I'm not. Yeah. I'm actually going to him saying, "Can we build a treehouse?
Mm-hmm.
Can we build this business together? Can we build this family together? Can we do this? Because I don't know how to do it alone, and you seem to know what you're doing." And it's kind of different people bond with God different ways. I bond with God working with Him.
Yeah.
Because I like to work. I'm not a workaholic, but I like to work. I like to build things, and I like the creative process. So, and so I don't know where I'm going with that, except to say that it's just worked for me. and it's been really fun. And I'm just convinced he actually delights in it. He's like, finally, you're paying attention to
Beautiful.
me.
That's beautiful.
You want me? I mean, if my daughter comes to me and says, "Can we like build a fort?" I'm like, "You want me? You want to hang out with me?" Yes, we can build a fort. Do whatever the frick you want. I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't say frick to my daughter, but
Oh, good.
not yet. Wait till she's a teenager.
Yeah,
And
when
then
she's a teenager and you're
I'll
throwing the F bomb at her.
the light F bomb.
Yeah, the light
the
F
evangelical F bomb.
bomb. Yeah, there you go. So the father son project, and I'm going to make a really bad dad joke. The
No, please.
father son nonfiction book.
Yep. They're very funny.
Yeah, I told you it was a bad one. Okay, so now you started to say this, but I want to ask you another question. So you said, no, I'm going to come back to. I'm going to ask you at the end. We're going to say that. All right. So today you're the CEO of your own marketing company. It's called StoryBrand. I went to one of your seminars like 6 or 7 years ago. It was amazing. That. And how are you using the lessons you learned early on? Like how did StoryBrand come about? What was the genesis or the evolution? And if you can pull a few of these textbook publishing, writing books through, what's the through line for you if you had to create a plot around that?
Well, I'll tell you the plot. I'll tell you the consistent thing that has happened to me. And it's literally a consistent process of disrupting yourself to steal your line.
I like how you did that.
Sitting down and writing a letter to yourself. By the way, that letter was written to say I was going to accomplish all this by the time I was 35. When Sandy called me, I was 35. So, talk about prophetic. I don't know what it is, but sitting down saying I'm going to do this by the time I'm 35 is disrupting yourself. Getting in a van and driving to Oregon with a guy you've just recently become friends with, who's, by the way, when we got to Oregon, I introduced him to a pen pal of mine. They are now married, and their daughter is in the other room. She works here. So, it's amazing. Her name is Dagny. I'm gonna get choked up. My 2.5-year-old daughter is going to be the flower girl in Dagny's wedding this April. So it's just fun. But I think there's this thing that you do that you just go, okay, my life is like, my life is kind of becoming mundane. So it's time to disrupt yourself, time to get in the van, time to write out, I'm going to be a best-selling author, time to start a publishing company, time to do whatever. So there's this constant, the theme of my life is really curiosity about story. I mean, if you could point all the threads, but the curiosity about story is this constant sort of, well, let's disrupt this, let's disrupt this, let's disrupt this again, let's do this, and try to do something different. When the credits start to roll on whatever you're working on, it's time to disrupt yourself and start a new story. Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of your controlling idea for your career and the thoughts that you bring into the world. If I were a therapist, and I'm not, first of all, I'd be a terrible therapist because I'd be like, you sound like a wimp. You should just be tough. Leave. Whatever. I'd be awful. But the thing that I would say is, like, you got to stop doing that. You need to disrupt yourself. You need to leave your husband. You need to get out of here. You need to, whatever. Like, you need, this man is abusive. I don't know what you're doing. Disrupt yourself. Like, get out of this mode that you're in. And there's great power to that. So, all that to say, if you look back, it's disrupt yourself. So the StoryBrand stuff, what happened was, that memoir, Blue Like Jazz, was a success. So I wrote about 6 more of those, which would put me up to, actually 5 more, which would put me up to 7 memoir-esque books. I say memoir-esque because they weren't real memoirs. They were like my personal story as it relates to religion, or my personal story as it relates to fatherhood, or my personal story as it relates to marriage. So they were topical memoirs. I was kind of done with that. I didn't have anything else to talk about in terms of my life, but I'd been studying story and story structure for so long that I disrupted my life as a memoirist and wrote a business book. And that book ended up selling another 1 million copies, building a story brand. And all of a sudden, people are calling me, asking me to help them clarify their stories, which, if you think about it, I've been set up for that because I've clarified my own story for so long. And now I can help you clarify your personal brand story, your marketing story for your company. And all of a sudden, I didn't want to write memoirs anymore, but I disrupted that whole system. and started over. I call it my second career. My first career was memoirist. My second career is business coaching, really, and especially as it relates to marketing and messaging. And, got lucky enough to hit another home run.
Yeah.
And it's not that it was easy. It was really difficult. There was nobody won the lottery, and wrote about something I was intensely curious about. Now, Whitney, you tell me, if I had gone to you 5 years ago and said, hey, I'm thinking about writing a book about how ancient narrative structures can be laid over marketing ideas to create a messaging filter for corporate entities. That
When
book
you
is going
say
to
it like
sell.
that's your
That book's going to
bowling
sell
ball.
12 copies,
Yeah,
and my
that's your
mother's going to
bowling
buy it.
ball, Donald.
Yeah. And so, but I was really curious about it. I was like, this is very interesting to me. And it's fascinating how these puzzle pieces come together. I thought, I don't care if the publisher wants it. I want to write it. And was rewarded for that. For me, there was a moral in that story too. And the moral was chase your curiosity. You have no idea where it could take you. And people also, by the way, get really excited about anybody else who's excited about anything. They just do. People who are excited about something are interesting, and it almost doesn't matter what it is. They're just interesting, right? They're fascinated by something. So people who are fascinated are fascinating. I had the honor, top 5 people I've ever sat down and had a conversation with. Monday, I flew to Wichita, Kansas. And on Tuesday, I had lunch with Charles Koch. Charles Koch dominates 13 verticals of the American economy. 13 of them. He is worth more than $100 billion. He's 88 years old. And I didn't know, I had to have, I think, 2 or 3 meetings before I had lunch with Charles Koch to prepare me to have lunch with Charles Koch, with his team. You get there, there's documentaries made, because he's a chemical engineer, and he's been a little bit in oil and all that kind of stuff. His record on the environment is actually astonishing, but people have used him as a straw man. So, he can be sort of controversial. He is one of the most generous human beings on the planet. He has plans to solve poverty, criminal justice reform. I mean, he's just unbelievable what this guy has done. Sadly, people have, labeled him as some sort of bad guy, and he's just not. He's just one of the most. He's amazing. But anytime you succeed, they're going to come after you. So I didn't know what to expect. I expected an extremely powerful man. And what I got was, I walk into the room, he puts me at the head of the table. I said, Mr. Koch, I'm very uncomfortable sitting at the head of this table. And he said, well, you don't have a choice. Sit at the head of the table, because we are all here. There's like 4 of us in the room. We're all here to learn from you. And I'm like, Mr. Koch, again, I'm not here to talk. Well, if you're not here to talk, why are you here? And he was the most humble, funny, thoughtful, but the one word that described Charles Koch more than anything else was intensely curious. He was driven by the joy of learning. And I don't think that guy cares at all about money. He's just made a lot of money because he's so freaking curious. And he had zero ego. I can't even explain how little ego this man had. And I loved it. Top 5 people I've ever met in my life. And super inspirational, and just so 88 years old.
Wow.
Could run circles around me with his intellect.
Wow.
And is nowhere near retiring. In fact, he said his wife will not let him retire because she doesn't want him at home. So, he's just great. But I think there's something to be said for the association of curiosity and success.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's, people talk about grit. They talk about salesmanship. They talk about intelligence. People don't talk about curiosity as a strategic advantage, and I think it is.
Ooh, is that a new book on the way
No.
for you? All right. So question for you, because I'm looking at the time.
We're good. I should be okay.
Actually, before you go on, who are 1 or 2 other interesting people you had lunch with?
Okay. Well, there's a lot of them that have been, sort of more than lunch.
Well,
but I did have lunch. When I think about the figures who have been influential in my career, when I wrote Blue Like Jazz, I read Catcher in the Rye probably 25 times, because I liked J.D. Salinger's voice so much in that book. and it would put me in this sort of literary cadence that would give me a tone
Huh.
that I liked. And it was almost like if I pretended to be Holden Caulfield writing about religion, my soul was set free to say whatever I wanted. And I don't know why it worked. And nobody ever realized that except for Philip Yancey.
Huh.
And okay, so that's one book, and I'm going to come back to this in a second. The second book was Anne Lamott's Traveling Mercies. So I would read those two books, and Holden Caulfield gave me the voice, but Anne Lamott gave me permission to be vulnerable and to tell my truth, especially in the context of religion where nobody tells the truth. Everybody pretends they play a role and they pretend to be somebody else so that they don't get caught being human. And so Anne Lamott was like, I don't give a rat's ass who you think I am. I love Jesus, and I'm going to talk about it, and fuck you if you don't like it. That was her whole attitude. And I'm just like, I love this woman. So obviously I didn't have lunch with J.D. Salinger, but Anne Lamott called and said, can we get lunch? I noticed you're going to be in San Francisco. And so she took me to Chez Panisse, and we had lunch right there in Berkeley. And she was fantastic. She was just fantastic. And the whole time I'm like, why is this woman, this literary giant, having lunch with me? I don't understand. But she thought I was funny, and I thought she was funny. And we emailed back and forth and text message, almost to this day. And that was another one. But I'll go back to the Philip Yancey story. I'm opening for Philip Yancey in the first ever book festival I've ever been invited to. And I was a no-name author. It was a Portland Book Festival, but they were like, hey, who can we get locally to open for Philip Yancey? Because he's selling out this giant theater. And they were like, well, there's this guy, Don Miller. He'll be cheap, and he just has to drive like 5 miles, so let's grab him. I walk into the green room. Now, Philip Yancey is a hero of mine. He's written some incredible books. He has just a ferocious intellect, and he's a great writer. I walk in the room, and he said, J.D. Salinger and Anne Lamott. That's what he said to me. The first thing Philip Yancey ever said to me. And I said, how did you know? And he goes, it's obvious.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, some people just have loads of, intelligence beyond the rest of us. And Philip Yancey and Anne Lamott and Charles Koch are three of those people for me.
Great stories. Okay. Now we are going to talk briefly about your next book, Coach Builder. And here's the challenge. We'll see if you're up for it. So one of the things that we find a recurring theme for people who are considering jumping to a new S-curve to disrupting themselves, going through our certification is, how do I talk about what I do? Meaning I'm now a coach, and that's what your book is about. And what do I charge? And what I would love for you to do is call upon your story brand chops for just a moment and give us a script.
A script for a formula for you to use as a coach?
Yeah, for people listening. Yeah, because they'll want to read your book, but I want to give them something like really tangible right now. What does that sound like? I'm asking you to improv a little bit.
It sounds like this. It sounds like if you or anybody you know struggles with X, I became a coach to help you solve that problem. That's really it. The problem is the hook. So every coach getting into a coaching business or pivoting their career into coaching business needs to take a sheet of paper and they need to write down every problem that they are good at solving, as a coach. And that may be 20 problems. And then you actually need to circle the ones that people would pay the most to have solved. For instance, like slumping sales or tax loopholes strategy. You're paying too much in taxes. What is it that you solve that's worth a lot of money? And then actually ask yourself, do I want to do that for 10 years? And if you don't do it. But if you do, you want to pick the top one, and that's your territory. And now you're going to go out and you're going to control that territory, and you're going to own that territory. For instance, here's how powerful this is. When you actually lead with a problem, all of us, when you say, a lot of people struggle with this, I solved that problem. Anybody you're talking to perceives that your value as a human being is exponentially higher. Because we value people, things, products that solve problems. Anything that you value is something that solves a problem. And any business that takes off, they figured out a problem that needed to be solved that nobody else was solving, or they weren't solving it well enough. So I often use this. In fact, I flew into Baltimore not too long ago, and I don't usually use that. I don't usually say, people struggle with this. I solved the problem. Because if I do, the person wants free consulting. So I usually don't say it. But I got into an Uber. Young man named Christian was my driver. My client is national security, cybersecurity. It's literally 2 miles from the airport. You can see the building from the airport. So we have a very short drive. He's morally obligated to let me out of the car. So this is not going to be a long conversation. He says, "What brings you to town?" I say, "Business or pleasure?" I say, "Business." He said, "What sort of business are you in?" I say, "Well, a lot of people have ideas or products, but they don't know how to talk about them to get other people to pay attention. When they don't know how to talk about something, they call me." And he turned down the radio and he said, "You are a very important person." I mean, can you believe that? I'm like, wow, that worked.
Yes, I am.
And he said, "Don, I need help talking about something." And I'm like, okay, well, here we go. He's going to want free consulting. He pulls over at the gate of national security. And there are guys with assault rifles all around us because he's not going through the gate. He's just pulling. And I'm like, this is not the place to stop. And he says, "Don, you got to help me." I'm like, "Okay, what is it? You got a side business? You got a side hustle? What you thinking about?" He goes, "No, I got to break up with my girlfriend." And he wants me to give him messaging advice on how to break up with his girlfriend. And I do. We spend like 10 minutes, and most of it's like, "Nah, Christian, you can't say that, man. I honestly think she's better off without him." Anyway, we emailed back and forth a little bit. It was really a fun exchange. But if you actually introduce yourself as the person who solves that problem, and if that problem is something people will pay money to solve, you will never suffer for money again. You'll also never suffer for respect or for admiration. Now, if you don't like solving that problem, you're going to hate your life. So it's also got to kind of light you up. But that would be my advice. If you're starting a coaching business, it all starts with, what problem do you solve? Your whole brand is built on the foundation of the problem you solve.
Okay. I love it. All right. One more question. And then I want you to talk about the gifts that you have for our listeners. So the
Okay.
question is, how do you counsel people on what to charge?
Well, more than you're charging is 95% always true. There's two things. One is, you actually want to understand that if you're a coach, you're not charging for your time and you're not charging for your wisdom. What you're charging for is for the money that they can make if they take your advice. So every coach, because we're talking about an economic question here, so it's an economic answer. If you're talking about how much to charge, you're talking about money. So let me talk about money. If you, for instance, I gave a talk recently to 250 sales executives, account executives, sales reps. I said, "Hey, I could sit here and talk about philosophy of sales, but the proof is in the pudding. Open up your laptop. We're going to email a client right now. Like, raise your hand if you got somebody sitting the fence." 250 hands go up because that's their job. And I said, "You've emailed these people. They're not closed. They're not closing the deal. Get out your laptop. We're going to email them right now. We're going to start with the problem. We're going to position the product as the solution to the problem. We're going to give them a 3-step plan from their problem to your product. We're going to give them the negative stakes of what happens if they don't buy from you, the positive stakes of what happens if they do buy from you, and then we're going to ask them to buy. Let's go through it." 250 people did that. It took us about 60 minutes. 2 days later, the chief revenue officer called my office and said, "We closed $2.5 million worth of sales off that lecture. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the company."
Okay, that is a high ROI for them, because I'm
It's a high ROI.
guessing you probably did not charge them $250,000 for that.
I did not charge them $250,000.
Oh,
My fee for speaking is X. It's not that high.
Yeah.
But what they're actually buying is a $2.5 million return. They're not buying a speaker. And so when you understand that, one, it puts a fire under you to make these people money. You are a business coach. You got to make them money.
Mhm.
Now, there's all sorts of ways to make money: team alignment, increasing team morale, decreasing turnover, increasing retention. There's some that are not quite as easy to talk about as sales, because sales is like you can put a dollar on it. But I think that you're worth more. You begin to understand your own worth when you realize how much money it's making or saving people.
Yeah.
And a buddy of mine wrote a book about the Enneagram, sent out an email that said, "Hey, I'm doing this spiritual formation retreat. It's $50, and we're going to talk about the Enneagram as it relates to spiritual formation." I hit reply, and I said, "Man, I love it. You realize that you could give that same lecture to a group of people building team unity in a corporation and charge $10,000, not $50.
Is that
and my phone rings.
Ian Morgan Cron?
Ian Cron.
Okay, I read the book. It's good.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Keep going.
Yeah, The Road Back to You. So Ian, my phone rings because Ian and I are friends. He goes, "What are you talking about?" And I explained, like, Enneagram is a great tool for team unity. Yeah. Like if I can understand everybody on the team and why that person is always mad at me, and and why this person, we don't want to motivate them this way, we want to motivate them a different way. You take all that Enneagram stuff, you turn it into team building. He did that. Ian now has a second home in Mexico, and he's got a gorgeous, beautiful house in 12 South here in Nashville. And that's what he does. He works with corporations on team unity stuff, and he's freaking good at it. But that's a way to take the same product, figure out how that can make people money, and then charge a percentage, a very tiny percentage, by the way. So the way I price products is I guarantee a 10x return on your investment. If you don't make a 10x return on what you're paying me, I'll write you a check. And the way I always word that to them is I always say, the reason I will write you a check and give you your money back is because I don't want anybody ever say to me that I lost them money. And I can't afford that. My reputation can't afford that. Oh. And I've never written a check.
So good. All right.
So that's it. You want to think of yourself as selling money. So how much money should it cost for you to make this much money, and to make it a small percentage, and you're great.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, before you go to what your gifts are, what number are you on the Enneagram?
3 with a 3 wing. I don't even have a wing. It's just like, we need to win. That's all I think about is how are we going to win? Or how are they going to win? How's my client going to win?
I love it.
Right?
I love it.
How are they going to win?
Okay. What are our gifts for our listeners?
All right. Well, I got a book called Coach Builder. And if you go to coachbuilder.com/disrupt, you pre-order the book on Amazon. It comes out in a few weeks. But if you go to coachbuilder.com/disrupt, there's a 90-minute audio summary of the book. So this means you don't have to buy the audio book. I'll give you basically a 90-minute summary of the book right now. And then there's also a lot of coaches and people who pivoting their career to coaches are thinking about starting a coaching business. They don't know how to sell themselves. And so I actually put together a PDF of 27 different coaches' websites who are making a lot of money. And you can actually look at those websites and go, oh my gosh, I do that. I could do this. And you can, in your mind, you'll start creating your own website and your own sales pitch on how you would sell yourself. Oh, so buy the book. It's $20 or so, $25 on Amazon. And then go to coachbuilder.com/disrupt and get that PDF. And a lot of you are going to quit your jobs and become a coach. And I hope you do.
Oh, love it. 3 more questions.
Yes.
What's going to be true for you in 10 years? What are you manifesting right now?
In 10 years, I'll be in a position to jump into the Iowa caucus, New Hampshire primary, and South Carolina primary for president of the United States. I don't know if I will do it or even will want to do it. I'm certainly not in a position to do that right now. But if we have 25,000 coaches and I've sold 60% of my company, I do a lot of strategy for politicians and a lot of campaign narratives. And if I don't find a candidate that I can work with to help them get elected, then I'll run myself. I won't run to win because I don't necessarily. I mean, I would take the job if they gave me the job, but it's a very far-fetched idea. But if you jump into a primary and you do decently okay, whoever gets elected, calls you and says, "Hey, can you?" And what I want them to do is call me and say, "Can you help me organize my entire messaging strategy around every cabinet member?" And that's my dream job. I want a job in the White House running communication strategy for every member of the president's cabinet. Because to me, it's like, that's how you can influence the world and not have to pardon a turkey.
Do it. I love it.
Yeah, we'll see.
I love it.
It's 10 years from now. So that's the absurd vision.
Okay.
And that's it.
All right.
And also my daughter loves me and my wife loves me. My wife says, if you ever run for office, I'm going to throw a press conference for your opponent. So I've got that to deal with. Quite a challenge there. 10
years to StoryBrand her, so she's bought into it.
There you go. Slowly lobbying her right now.
So what's been useful to you in this conversation?
I think, first of all, the realization, and I will take this forevermore with me, the realization that so many wonderful things have happened in my life because I've disrupted myself. And now I have somebody to send them to if they want to do it. I can send them to you.
After they become a coach.
There you go.
All right. So final question for you. What do you want people to think and feel and do when they finish reading your book, Coach Builder?
I want them to feel empowered. Yeah, I want them to say, "Oh, all I needed was some simple knowledge." And Don showed me how to do it. There's a transition that happens in most people's lives. I remember interviewing Pete Carroll. He was coach of the Seattle Seahawks at the time. This is before he drafted Russell Wilson and won a Super Bowl. And I asked him, I said, "What do you love about coaching?" And he said, "When I was young, I succeeded as an athlete. I was very competitive. And I'm so grateful I succeeded as an athlete early because it taught me there's no meaning in it. I was depressed. I was winning everything and I was depressed until I started coaching. And when I started helping other people win, there is no diminishing return on the fulfillment that you get by helping other people win." What a freaking amazing thing to say. So, Coach Builder, the whole movement is basically for people who are saying, "I already won and it didn't fulfill me. So how do I help other people win?" Here's my book, Coach Builder. Here's how you do
Amen. Thank you, Donald.
it. Thank you, Whitney. Wonderful to be with you.